to be or not to be, France's search for a sovereign. What is the role of a monarch? This might seem like a very silly question, kings rule, but it became one of the most controversial questions at the beginning of the 19th century. What kicked all of this off was the French Revolution. It was one of the earth-shaking events that transformed the way modern Europeans think of government. The traditional way of thinking about modern government was divine right, that men inherited a throne and a kingdom from their father. Occasionally, a woman could inherit, but that more often than not created controversy and turmoil in its own, because the throne, as well as the kingdom, was the personal property of the monarch. They owned it. In the modern era, we have come to accept the idea of popular sovereignty, that the people have the final say, that one way or another, the people determine the future goals, course of a country, that the government is a public thing, a public service. Whereas traditionally, that's not been the case. Traditionally, the government was the private property and private service of the monarch. The French Revolution helped spur this revolution in thinking. Even though the French cut off their king's head, there was still a very basic assumption that states needed a monarch. Monarchs were essential to how a state ran. But the question was, did a monarch govern or reign? Right? Did a monarch take part in the day-to-day activities of creating laws and enforcing laws? Or did a monarch simply wave and watch things go by and provide a symbol of national unity? What type of responsibility did a monarch have if things went wrong? Could a monarch be held responsible? Who would hold a monarch responsible? Did they answer to anybody? Under divine right monarchy, they only answered to God. God would sit in judgment over them when they died, but while they were alive, no one could judge them. At the beginning of the 19th century, there were four major approaches to the idea of monarchies. The first was by the Bourbons. They were the most conservative of the batch. They believed that the crown and the throne and the kingdom of France belonged to them, right? That they had inherited it. The Orleanists were a subsidiary branch of the Bourbons, and they were more willing to go along with legislative bodies because for them, it was a way to be in power. They were also more sympathetic to popular grumblings or grievances. And the last monarchical claim to the throne were the Bonapartists, who were the new kids on the block, where Napoleon Bonaparte seized the government of France in a coup, and then they asserted that they should inherit the throne because they were committed to revolutionary ideas of promoting equality, equality, and fraternity, even though they had no real inclination towards popular sovereignty. And then there were the most radical of the bunch, the Republicans, who argued that they did not need a monarch at all, that they could have a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, that the people expressed their will through representatives, and those representatives then had to stand for election. And if they did what was consistent with the popular will, they would stay in office. And if they did not, they would be thrown out. That was an incredibly unpopular opinion in the 19th century. The closest thing you get to that is on the other side of the Atlantic, what the American revolutionaries set up. They had no monarch. They had a chief executive, a president who presided. They had a Senate and a House of Representatives and a Supreme Court. They asserted that governments come from the consent of the governed. Very few in Europe were willing to take this risk in the 19th century. A corollary to the states need a monarch. What is the role of an assembly, or in the English word is parliament? Should a parliament or an assembly only be there to advise and consent? In other words, they have no real say. They're just a council for the government, a royal council. That's how Parliament started out in the Middle Ages. But the English Parliament took an active role in legislating. Should France have something more like England? Or should France limit its royal council to a purely advisory role? Should this assembly actually legislate, make laws that the king would then have to enforce? Was the king bound by these laws? Was it a situation like Magna Carta, where the king was subject to the laws, or was the king above the laws? Could the king ignore laws that he didn't like? All of these were open questions at the beginning of the 19th century. Did the legislature have any oversight role? Could the legislature watch what the executive did? And if the executive broke the law, could the legislature hold them accountable? Once again, in the American Republic, that was written into the Constitution with the whole concept of impeachment. That the legislature could impeach not only themselves, right, but their own members, but they could impeach judges as well as executive officers. That's an incredible oversight power that the executive has to answer to the legislature, that the legislature has more power than the executive. That when the legislature passes a law, it's the obligation of the executive branch to follow the law. All of these were questions that were open in the early 19th century. The recent history of France didn't make that any better or any easier to answer, because there was a period of turmoil from 1789 to 1799, where the French National Assembly wrote a constitution. The king refused to obey that constitution, and so the National Assembly chopped off the king's head. I mean, there's one thing you can say, that's oversight. The National Assembly declared themselves a republic and started purging their society of monarchs and papists and aristocrats, but that led to a systematic abuse of judicial power and fake trials and phony trials. And so the Republicans didn't do themselves any favor because they were so radical. It produced a condition in which French aristocrats and churchmen, members of the royal family, fled, ran to other countries. The immigrants, trying to seek refuge from the threat of violence, of the terror. Those immigrants then called up support from other monarchical and religious powers. The Pope declared the Republic an abomination. And so France's neighbors raised armies and went to war against the Republic, trying to restore the Bourbon dynasty. That they had an obligation to bring order to this lawless country. That war, as that war dragged on, neither side won major victories, but one man emerged as a hero, Napoleon. He positioned himself and took advantage of that position in a coup in 1799. As a general, he used his troops to seize control of what he considered a failed republic. But even though he was using the military, he said, well, I'm doing this to promote liberty, fraternity, equality, right? I'm living the revolutionary ideals because the system, the Republican system, failed those ideals. And I, as a general, can make this happen. I can bring about liberty. I can bring about fraternity. I can bring about equality. And I can bring law and order. And then he declared himself emperor in 1804. The question is, reality is that his army provided him the basis for seizing power, but he used a plebiscite to justify that. He did it once after the coup, and he did it another time when he declared himself emperor. He asked in a vote, he put it to a vote, he said, do you, the French people, support me as emperor? And the answer came back, yes. He said, sire, this is popular sovereignty. I am not here by the will of God. I am not here by the will of the military. I am here by the will of the French people. I will exercise their will. He established then a bicameral legislature, a lower house that were directly elected from the people, and then an upper house that would be a Senate, people that he could appoint, senior statesmen, respected community members who had better judgment. And the two of them would advise him as emperor. Now, make no mistake that Napoleon was the deciding factor in this government. But he did ask for opinions. He did ask for criticism. He did invite suggestions. And in many cases, Napoleon was smart enough to take those suggestions. Right? He created a law code. He built roads and bridges and ports, supported commerce. This made Napoleon incredibly popular at home. But Napoleon then took that popularity and continued the wars. And one fatal mistake in that war is in 1812, he marched to Moscow, was able to conquer and seize control of Moscow, but he had no logistical support. And when he got there, he froze to death and then had to retreat. And that constant retreat kept him on the move, eventually defeated once and was set to exile on an island, and then came back for 100 days and tried to raise another army and said, I'm going to do this again. This time he was defeated at Waterloo, and that was the end of it. But it wasn't the end of the bigger question. Which type of government actually provides stability? a strong monarchy or a republic? The French Revolution really didn't answer those questions because it was a period of turmoil and chaos for most of Europe. And most Europeans wanted nothing of the democratic movement, which they saw as a mob, and they didn't want anything of the despotic movement, which they saw Napoleon. There was this big question, can we not just return to normal? Can we not conserve what we've been doing? So the early 19th century kicks off a conservative movement. But it doesn't put to rest the bigger questions of whether a monarch was actually necessary for a government. Was a monarch the best way to organize sovereignty? Or should the people be sovereign? In the earliest parts of the 19th century, all across Europe, there was a clear consensus that monarchs were necessary and monarchs should hold sovereignty. But their failures over the course of the 19th century and the awakening of participatory government with the French Revolution slowly eroded the confidence in monarchs and slowly built up the case for a republic or popular sovereignty. So we're going to look at three things. We're going to start with the Restoration period in the early 19th century, right after Waterloo, and move then to the July Revolution in 1830 and end with the Revolution of 1848.